The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome once again to NDE Radio with me, Lee Witting. Whether you're listening by podcast or through the archives of our ad-free shows on our YouTube channel. When he was just 16, our guest today, Randy Schiefer, was so traumatized by his beloved father's death that it set a course for the rest of his life that only a series of COVID-induced NDEs could overcome. On that fateful day, Randy, his mother, and younger sister were in a Florida hotel room when his father collapsed with a massive heart attack. While his mother screamed at Randy to do something to save his father, and his 6-year-old little sister wept, Randy desperately tried to remember what he'd once read in a handbook on how to do CPR. He did everything he could. He ran down the hall, pounded on doors to get help, pleaded with a hotel clerk to call an ambulance. But in the end, it all proved hopeless, and his dad died in Randy's arms. Randy blamed himself for the death of his dad. But more than that, the guilt left Randy with an obsession about death itself. After earning an undergraduate degree in psychology, he committed himself to a master's degree in forensic science and a career as a homicide detective, attending autopsies and specializing in death investigations. He spent 20 years in the United States Air Force working with their security police and as a special agent in the Office of Special Investigations. And from the Air Force, Randy started teaching at the collegiate level, entering as an adjunct instructor and working his way to department chair and finally as the college campus director. And all that time, Randy remained quiet about his greatest secret, the panic attacks he felt when he thought about his own death. He could not even consider it without violent PTSD reactions, flailing about, a spasmodic display of the terror that possessed him. And because of all this, Randy today feels great gratitude for his near fatal bout with COVID, which came on March of 2020. And today, Randy will tell you how his COVID-induced NDEs actually saved his life. Randy Schiefer, welcome to NDE Radio.
Oh, thank you so much, Lee. It's such a pleasure to be on your show today. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, well, it's great to have you. Yours is a remarkable and unique story. Randy, first, tell me if I got anything wrong in my introduction about how PTSD from your father's death led you to a career as a death detective.
No, sir, you got all of that excellently spot on. That was the first true traumatic experience that I had gone through. And my father and I were very, very close. And I never dealt with it. I never dealt with his death. I never dealt with the grieving process. And, he died in 1969. So there wasn't, a whole lot of assistance and therapy programs that we have today.
Yes. I was an ambulance attendant in the 80s, and even then we didn't have defibrillators on board the ambulance, just to give you an idea of how long it took for people to get on with the necessary work of extended CPR.
Yeah. In fact, if you remember, even in 1969, they call it pulmonary resuscitation, completely different to the CPR that we know, today.
Yes.
And not everybody was trained in it. And I happened to read a few pages out of a chapter, and I lived with that guilt of not finishing that chapter, not saving my father. And I guess some of it as well is the traumatic experience that my mother went through from then on because of my failure.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you felt that as well. Given what you told me about the fact that he needed a stent, I don't think there was anything you could have done, even if you'd mastered CPR, to bring him back. Under those conditions, it was just a blockage he couldn't overcome, and you wouldn't have been able to either. One of the ironies of all this is when you came face to face with life-threatening COVID, it sort of snuck up on you. I mean, there you were, so afraid of death, but your daughter dropped you off at the ER and said, I'll wait for you in the car, like it was you're going to go in and take a pill and be out to see her in a few minutes. And neither of you realized how close to death you were.
No, not at all. She actually came to, I had gone to see my primary care doctor just a few days before. And and this was in March of 2020. So I got it very, very early on. And he just basically told me, he says, oh, you have the flu. My wife has the same thing. Go home, rest, come back in a week, if you're not feeling better. Well, 2 days later, I was so nauseous and I knew I was sick. And I had asked him as well in that first visit to test me for COVID. And he said, no, you don't have that. He says, just go home and rest. So I was able to get a second appointment, or second same day appointment, I should say. And I went back to see, this time, a physician assistant. And he told me the exact same thing that the doctor told me. He says, oh, you have the flu. He says, my wife is home with the same thing. And I'm sitting there saying, is this like a standard response? And, go. And I said, look, I am sick. I know I'm sick. Can I get tested for COVID? And at the time, back in 2020, they had those 5 or 6 questions that they would ask you, have you traveled? Have you been in contact with somebody who's, and of course it was all no, no, no. And he says, no, go home and rest. He said, come back in a week. Well, the very next day, my oldest daughter stopped by the house to check on me because my wife had to go do an errand for my youngest daughter. So she just swung by the house to check on me. And she called my youngest daughter, Lisa, who's a nurse. And she said, boy, Dad really looks gray. He looks sick. So Lisa said, well, get him to the emergency room right away. So she took me down. And as you said, I walked through that door and we blew each other a kiss. And little did I know it would be almost 6 weeks later before I would ever see a family member again.
Wow. Well, I'd like you to go through all the various steps that you had to go through. First, I guess, on a ventilator, and then an induced coma, ventilator, dialysis, sure. And then the ECMO machine.
Yeah, let me share with you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
and then I was going to say, then we should talk about how much your daughters were doing in the meantime to supplement what the hospital was doing. So,
yes, by all means. I have a remarkable family, beautiful family, and I'm not sure if I deserve them. And but they stood up for Dad, but let me start from the beginning. They admitted me. I got my medical records after, and I didn't even know this, but they admitted me in critical condition with bilateral pneumonia. My pulse oxygen rate in the ER at that time was at 81. And normal, it's, about 90, 95 to 100, and so I couldn't exchange the air in my lungs. And they put me up in a regular room on a medical ward. And just a few hours later, they rushed me into the ICU. And within 2 days, within about a day and a half, they put me on a ventilator because my pulse ox had dropped down into the 70s, and they put me on the ventilator. And within 24 hours of an event, I maxed it out. So they care flighted me over to a larger hospital, and I went straight into surgery and put on an ECMO machine, which is basically a heart-lung bypass. Essentially, they go in through the right jugular vein with a tube into your heart, and that pulls the blood out, oxygenates it, allows the heart and the lungs to rest and try to heal, and then pushes the blood back into your body. And I was on that for 14 days. I was on the ECMO machine for 14 days, and in a medically induced coma. As soon as they put me on the ventilator, they put me into a coma as well. So I was obviously not responsive from being in a coma. I had intubated tube down my throat. I had feeding tubes down my nose. Within 24 hours of getting on the ECMO, my kidneys failed, and they put me on dialysis for that. And shortly after that, my liver started to throw high enzymes off and mimic, I believe this word is mimic PIC. And my heart enlarged and started not to pump adequately. So they transferred a lot of that responsibility over to the ECMO machine to try to get my heart stabilized. And then I started to bleed. COVID attacked my vascular system, and I started to bleed as well. And I've got several units of blood and plasma during the period that I was in that coma. And unbeknownst to me, my family was at home fighting for me. I have 3 girls and my wife, of course, and they weren't ready to lose their dad, and especially to this disease. And they sat down. I had one daughter, my middle daughter, Kate, lived in Nashville and still does, but she flew down. Erin, my oldest, obviously came right up to the house. And then my younger daughter, Lisa, who's a labor and delivery nurse, was over in Mississippi, living in Mississippi, and she came home to support their mom. And they sat down, I guess, in the living room and said, okay, how are we going to help Dad? You know, he would be in our bar park helping us if we were in that bed. So how can we help him? So Lisa called a friend of hers up in Kentucky. Lisa went to the University of Kentucky and got her nursing degree from there. And her father, this girl that she called, her father was the infectious disease doctor for the state, and immediately told Lisa to get me convalescent plasma. Immediately, he says, you find a donor and you get him convalescent plasma. So Lisa had told the hospital that she wanted me to receive convalescent plasma, and they denied her request. They said they weren't a teaching hospital, they weren't a research hospital, and there wasn't enough data on the use of convalescent plasma, if it was even successful. So after several meetings with the hospital administrators and doctors, they finally said, well, if you can figure out how to get it, we will consider giving it. So that kicked in. Boy, that kicked my girls to work, because my oldest daughter knew that prayers would work. She took on organizing all of the prayer chains. And recently she gave me a map of the United States. And I think there's only three states, maybe 4, that she did not have someone, a church group, a prayer group, a Bible study group, friends, neighbors. They were all praying for me, all praying for me to get better. And then she had Canada, Australia, England, Italy, all praying for me as well. We know people in those countries, and they all got my, and strangers as well, emailed, and they said they saw my middle daughter, Kate, put out a post on Facebook, and that they saw the post, and they were forming prayer groups for me in these other countries as well. It was just absolutely phenomenal response for a man that's not deserving of all of that. You know, I'm sorry, because I never did anything great in my life, but my middle daughter put out a post calling for convalescent plasma and explained what it was. It was the plasma from an individual that had COVID and gotten better, but he still has the antibodies to fight COVID. And they removed the plasma and his plasma, and then they would give it to me. Well, they had 2 pages of volunteers. That Facebook message went out to over 70,000 people, 75,000 people.
Wow.
Who saw it, went around the world. And because they were getting contacted from people around the world wanting to come to Florida, where I live, to donate plasma. So they got a hold of our blood donation center, which is One Blood, and talked with them and said they wanted convalescent plasma collected. And One Blood didn't have anybody trained in taking convalescent plasma. But they never said no, and they never said we can't do it. They stepped up, and they sent people out to get trained. And they had my family identified one young man, not very far from where we live, who volunteered, and he was a pastor in a local church there, and he stepped up and he donated his plasma. So One Blood called my family and said that the hospital was in possession of the convalescent plasma. So my daughter called the hospital and said, okay, when are you going to give this to my dad? And they said, well, we've changed our mind. We're not going to do it. We're not going to give it to him. Yeah. And of course she said, well, why not? I said, well, it's a pathogen. It's a bloodborne product, and we don't know how he's going to react to it. And she said, you've already given him blood. You've already given him plasma. You've already given him other blood products. That's no reason not to give him this. And then they came back and said, well, it was an ethical issue, that the ethical board convened and they determined that, no, they weren't going to give it to me because it was an ethical issue. So they were getting all this pushback from the hospital, but boy, my kids just steadfast and weren't going to let me die. In the meantime, they received a phone call from my doctors saying that I had about a 3% chance of living. And it's confirmed in my medical records that of my probable demise, and that they only had estimated me at a 3% of living. And my daughters had one more meeting with them, and that was on Good Friday, 2020 Good Friday. I think it was April the 10th, and convinced them that it was the right thing to do to give me this plasma. And they got a phone call that evening from one of the technicians on the ward saying that they had received permission to give it, and they were going to give me the convalescent plasma. I received it on Good Friday. By Easter morning, my lungs were completely clear of COVID glass. And remember, my lungs were filled with COVID glass, as white as this white shirt that I have on. I saw the x-ray.
Wow.
By Sunday, it was completely gone. By Tuesday, my kidneys started to fully function, and they took me off of dialysis. My liver returned to normal, and so did my heart. And the doctor actually called my daughter and said, okay, tell us how you went about getting this convalescent plasma. We want more of it. And my daughter did. She told him. And matter of fact, they said, well, we really don't have a protocol. We don't have a set of instructions on, how this operates. And my daughter said, well, give me 45 minutes and you'll have your protocol. And she actually sat and wrote the hospital protocol for him. And she actually went down and donated her plasma because she had COVID as well and had very, very mild symptoms. But she had the antibodies, and she actually donated her plasma, and it went to 4 different people that day, and they survived. So I was the first person in Northwest Florida to receive convalescent plasma, and the 34th in the nation. And I know that because my family had to go to the FDA for emergency authorization use. And my number that came back was 00034. So I was the 34th person that received it in the nation as well.
That's a tremendous story. Okay, so we are going to move on into your NDEs now. I truly believe, generally speaking, that NDEs are personalized, that they're designed through, I don't know what the mechanics of it are, but they are personalized. And this one, the 4 that you had, seemed to be designed as a detective adventure. They were designed just for you, I think. And I say this because you managed to sneak into heaven with nobody watching every time. It was just like an adventure story.
Yeah,
so,
I was a little sleuth. I kind of slid in, and they kind of looked at me and said, what are you doing here? Get out. Yeah, I mean, like you said before, I was a homicide detective, and my whole world for over 30 years evolved around evidence. Evidence of a crime. And I like to say, well, there's several different kind of evidence, but I use these two as circumstantial evidence, where you can infer something. Like the Bible. One of Jesus's brothers um, didn't really believe in his scripture until he saw him after resurrection, and then started to believe. So you can infer that one led to the other. That's circumstantial evidence. But my world is physical evidence. I had to see, I had to find the fingerprints. I had to find the blood stain. I had to find the DNA. I had to have that direct link to show me that something, the crime occurred and who committed it. So, and I wasn't a very religious person at all. In a nutshell, I think my father's death contributed somewhat to that as well, because my mother was very angry over that, and church and God just kind of became secondary. I mean, we didn't pray, we didn't go to church, we didn't talk about it often. I think I went to sunrise services on the beach a few times, but that was only to impress some girl that I was trying to get to date me. And that was about the extent of my religious belief. Never read the Bible, never really understood it, never even tried to do that. So that's why I was coming religiously. But while my kids were fighting for me, and I was in this coma, I really laid kind of in the abyss between life and death. I was on that thin razor line. And I never officially died. I never coded, but I was as close as someone, could get. And I remember waking up, my consciousness awoke, and I was in a dark, I called it at the time a tube, a dark tunnel-like, and I wasn't moving really fast, but it was surrounded in a white light, beautiful light. And you could feel the warmth inside this tube, and I was trying to struggle to figure out where I was and what was happening. But it put me into a beautiful room. I came out and I was in this beautiful, large hall. It was absolutely magnificent. It had large chandeliers from the ceiling, big stained glass windows on both sides of the hall, big archways, big, beautiful golden archways around, and big water features all over. And I could sense there was commotion on the floor of this hall that I was in. But again, I snuck in the back door here. So I don't think that I was allowed to fully see what was going on, because I wasn't there too long. It didn't seem anyway, that this spirit came up to me, and it was an older gentleman. He had a beard and kind of a flowing gown on, a kind of wasn't a white, I want to say it was a dark flowing gown. And he came up to me and we briefly talked about how gorgeous this golden room was. It was absolutely beautiful. The floors was opaque. These archways were all outlined with gold. And then he finally said, "You do not belong here. You have to leave." And he pointed over to a set of big, beautiful oak doors. And afterwards, it reminded me, well, as a criminal investigator, I've been asked to leave a lot of crime scenes. So I was asked to leave. So I walked over to these big, beautiful oak doors, and I walked out, and I was in this magnificent city, absolutely gorgeous, magnificent city. And it was so clean and so beautiful. And the building structures just rose up as high as you could see them. And they were gold with opaque, almost clear opaque glass on them. And I remember my consciousness moving through these cities, and I would pass parks, and the parks were just beautifully maintained, beautiful green grass. I've been to the Highlands of Scotland and Ireland, and I've seen green grass, but it was more brilliant than even that. It was just absolutely gorgeous. Trees with magnificent color. And I continued in this city, and suddenly I realized that I was lost, and I couldn't find my way back. That I couldn't get back to where I was, and I became very scared and frightened because I was lost. And I said, "Who's going to find me, or how am I going to get found? How am I going to get back?" And I remember that I was cold. I was very cold, and I sat down on the curb, I guess it was, and I sat down, and I was cold, and I was tired, and I was scared, and I looked over my shoulder, and rising up into the sky was this beautiful staircase, beautiful white staircase. It just rose up into the heavens. And I said, well, if I can get to that staircase, maybe I can climb up far enough that somebody will see me, somebody will find me. So I did that. I remember making my way over, and I started up the staircase. And I couldn't tell you how far I got. I don't know how high I was, but I remember somebody yelling out, "There he is. There's Randy. Get him." And it was just like somebody grabbed me by the collar and just whisked me off of that staircase. And I was back in my dark little sedated world, as I call it. That just went dark. It just went blank. And I didn't know. It was a male voice, but I didn't know who grabbed me and pulled me off that staircase. And I had an opportunity to go back there, but I was in a different part of the city. When my consciousness awoke, I was in a different part of the city. I guess as a detective, I figured, well, okay, the first coming in the front door didn't work, so let me go in the back door, So I started meandering around through the city again. And I finally realized, again, it hit me. And I knew I was dead. Lee, I remember clearly saying to myself, you died, okay? You're dead, but you traveled somewhere. Where did I travel to? But I was so calm, and I was so at peace, and I felt so warm there that, you really don't want to leave. But I got lost. And I said, well, I know where those steps are. And I made my way back to those steps. And I started again to go up the steps. And I heard the same voice cry out again. There he is. There's Randy. Get him. But I turned. I remember turning and looking. And I saw this older gentleman, white beard with flowing white hair. And he was dressed in kind of a white gown. And he grabbed me. He's the one that grabbed me and pulled me off of that staircase. So I guess the security guards came out and said, there he is. He's trying to penetrate the perimeter again. Get him. And they threw me back out, But I was a very pesky little investigator, and my spirit, must be the same way, because it didn't take no for an answer. And remember, Lee, I don't know the sequence of any of these. What I'm telling you now could have been last, or my next little story where I was. I don't know the sequence of any of them. I just remember having them, being there, and experiencing this. And the experience was more than real. I had dreams. I definitely had dreams, and I had hallucinations. And I can tell the difference. Immediately, I can tell the difference between the two. And as I told my daughter, these were different. My dreams involved people that were still living. They involved my daughter. They involved some neighbors and friends of ours. So they all involved people. And the dreams were like a dream state. They weren't real clear. Your vision is kind of foggy, and so they were dreams. And there's no doubt in my mind that they were dreams. My hallucinations, they were scary at sometimes. I remember laying there, and I started to see these multicolored lightning bolts coming at me. And I remember opening my eyes and looking. And I looked up at the ceiling and I heard this god awful music playing and six panda bears dancing on the ceiling. And I said to myself, you know, you're dead and you must be in hell. I said, but there is no way that I can lay here and watch this for eternity. But when I closed my eyes again, I got the lightning bolts, you know, and I remember, you know, closing my eyes and seeing the pandas or seeing the lightning bolts and opening my eyes and seeing the pandas and going between the two of them until finally it was gone. That hallucination was gone. I can tell you others too that I had that were simply hallucinations. But my NDEs were so real and so vivid. There was no doubt in my mind whatsoever that I traveled. Matter of fact, when Lisa, my last week in the hospital, when I finally came off the ventilator and came off ECMO and everything, they allowed Lisa, the nurse, to come in and spend the last 3 or 4 days with me. And I remember telling her right away, before I even realized what had happened to me, I said, Lisa, I went somewhere, I traveled. And I remember her saying, we're here fighting for you and you're off traveling around the world. What is up with that? You know?
Well, and, speaking of traveling, I'd love to hear there are 2 more NDEs that you had. And I thought we might get through that. Well, maybe the next one could be the dirt path with the beautiful flowers on either side.
Yeah. No, I woke up. My consciousness awoke again, and I was making my way down this dirt path. And on both sides of the pathway were beautiful flowers, ornate vegetation, just beyond imagined colors, big, huge, beautiful trees. And I was walking, or my consciousness, I should say, was moving down this pathway. And suddenly before me, this little boy comes out. And I don't even know where he came from, but he just appeared. And he was very animated little boy. And he had olive skin, and he had what we call the old bowl cut. You know, his hair was kind of cut down right above his eyebrows, you know. Mm-hmm. Olive skin. He had a little pair of shorts on, no shirt, no shoes, but very animated. And he was sitting there and he started yelling, follow me, follow me. So I did. I followed him. And a short distance, he took me into a room. And he told me, he says, wait here. He says, I'll be back. So he's put me in this room, and it was a very beautiful room. It had paintings and gold, and it had these big, round, red pedestal seats, you know. So I was waiting. And again, you know, that time is not relevant up in heaven. So I don't know how long I was there, but I remember seeing a picture window, and I walked over to the picture window, and I saw this stream that ran underneath the building, and it kind of meandered off in the distance. And it too was lined with the same type of vegetation that I saw down the path, beautiful trees and flowers, and I saw a few people in the stream. They weren't playing or, you know, but they were casually standing on the side in the water on the banks, kind of talking and things like that. And I was waiting for this little boy, and I was taking in all of this, the sights and the warmth. And again, I remember clearly saying to myself that I was dead, but I didn't know where I was or what was going on. And I kept questioning myself, what is happening? What is happening? And suddenly this little boy comes back into the room, same little boy. And he goes, I'm sorry, you have to leave. And I said, but I don't really want to leave. I said, this is beautiful. You know, I feel so loved and accepted. I said, and I'm so calm. I have not been this calm my whole life. And he goes, no, he goes, I'm sorry. Your room is not ready. You have to leave. And with that, I went back into my dark little sedated world. And the Bible talks about God going up and preparing a room for you. And my room wasn't ready. So I got kicked out of it again. So, but I didn't give up. I knew I bound and determined I was going to get into heaven some way. So I remember my conscience came alive again. And I was in now I understand that it was the void, and it was a dark area, not not real pitch black dark, almost like a very late dusk. I say you could see some distance in front of you, and I was standing there, and my consciousness was looking around, and these little white orbs of light was kind of dashing all around us, around me, I should say. And suddenly I felt the presence of someone next to me. I couldn't see them, but I felt their presence. I knew someone was there. And he telepathically, no words were said, telepathically, he told me to follow him. So I followed him. And we started to go through into this void. And Lee, you've been to the theater, and you're sitting there in the audience looking at a very dark stage. Well, suddenly off in the distance, there's a light that slowly comes on and gets brighter and brighter. And suddenly there's a actor or actress sitting on stage. And that's what happened. I was moving through, and this little light to my left-hand side started to come on. And as we moved closer, it got brighter and brighter and brighter until I saw my deceased mother-in-law sitting there. And she had her arm rested. And the only description I can use is it was like a bar. And she had her arm rested on the bar, and she was sitting on this chair very regally, very straight, head rise, very regal, you know. And she was beautiful looking. She died of Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a horrible, horrible disease.
Yes.
But she was absolutely gorgeous. I told my wife she was probably in her mid-30s. But she had this beautiful white bow around her hair. She always had very long hair, and the hair was pulled up with this very beautiful white bow, and she had this white flowing gown on with a white belt around her waist and long sleeves. And she looked over at me. And when she did, I started yelling for her, "Dolores, it's me, it's Randy, I'm here, Randy." And she wouldn't acknowledge me. She wouldn't talk to me. She wouldn't say anything, but she just simply looked away. And I couldn't get her attention. And then suddenly this young man runs by us. And I recognized immediately as a deceased brother-in-law. And he died of a drug overdose. And it was him. It was in his late teens, I would say. And he didn't acknowledge me. He didn't acknowledge his mother, but he just kind of ran right past us. And my spirit guide told me we needed to move forward. We needed to move on. So as we were moving on, off in the distance, the light that was shining above my mother-in-law just slowly dimmed out, became very weak and dimmed out until she just totally disappeared. So we moved further. And again, as we moved deeper, off to my left, but further back, much further back, this light started to come on again. And I was sitting there saying, my parents, it's my parents. And there was my dad, my mom, and my sister. I didn't see them as well as I saw my mother-in-law because they were kept at a distance from me. And but I knew it was them. Immediately I knew it was them. And I started yelling again. "Dad, Mom, Gina, it's me, it's Randy. I'm here. Talk to me, I'm here." And they wouldn't. They actually turned their backs. My dad turned away first. And my mom and my sister stood for a few more seconds and then slowly just turned away and wouldn't acknowledge me. But while I was standing there, I felt that there was a barrier, an invisible barrier between me and them. My daughters later told me, "Dad, that would have been the veil of death." And it makes sense that my mother-in-law and my parents, my sister, didn't acknowledge me because they didn't want me to move forward. They didn't want me to pass through that veil of death because they knew it wasn't my time. And so they didn't want that connection to me to make me move forward, you know? So they didn't acknowledge me at all. So I was standing there, and again in heaven, you can virtually see 360 degrees. You get the feeling that you know everything that's going on around you. And way back behind me, over my right shoulder, this orb of light. I don't know what caught my attention to it, but I saw this orb of light approaching very, very quickly. And he came from my right hand side, and he came right in front of me, and he stopped. And I saw his face just for a brief second. But he says to me, "Tell Madison at the salon her grandfather's okay." And I knew he was a veteran. I mean, I'm a veteran. I had 20 years in the Air Force. And I just automatically knew and felt that he was a veteran. And he moved on to a white porch. And when he moved past me, he became that orb of light again. And he moved over and got onto a white porch. And he was an orb of light in human form. And he started making red, white, and blue ribbons and American flags. And it was shortly after that my spirit guide said, "You've got to leave. You have to go. You can't go any further. You have to go back." And I went back into my dark little sedated world of darkness. So when I finally came out of the coma and my daughter was with me, I started to tell her these experiences. And she said, "Dad, who is Madison?" And I said, "I don't know a Madison. I have no idea who Madison is." And she said, "Well, did you recognize the man that gave you the message?" And I said, "No, I don't know who he is. I've never saw him before." So she said, "Well, how are we going to find her?" And I said, "Well, I have to." I said, "I have a responsibility to find her. I was given this message. I have to find her." So a few days later, I'm discharged from the hospital, and I had to learn to walk again, and I had to learn to swallow, and a few other things. And I was home in my wheelchair, and I was home for, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 days. And something drew me to my dresser. I don't know why. I started rumbling through my dresser, one of the drawers in my dresser. And I came across a business card, and it was for a local barbershop here in town. I took it out to my daughter, and I said, "Hey, could you call these people and find out, with COVID going on and all the restrictions that we had to deal with, could you find out what their policy is for getting my hair cut?" I said, "I'd like to get it cut." So I came back. I wheeled myself back into my bedroom here, and she came back a few minutes later. And now I'm the interrogator in the family, okay?
Yes.
My kids grew up with me interrogating them and their boyfriends. Well, she starts interrogating me. Okay, "Dad, where'd you get this card?" I said, "What do you mean, where did I get it? Where did you get it?" "I don't know where I got it." "Well, where'd you find it?" "I found it in the dresser." "How long have you had it?" I said, "Lisa, enough with the questions. What do you want?" And she goes, "Dad, I think we found your Madison."
Wow.
I said, what are you talking about?" And she handed me the card. She goes, "Look at the card." And here on the card, clear as day, was written Madison Logan on the card. I never recognized it. I never saw it, but there it was, clear as day. I said, "Make an appointment with her. I want her to cut my hair." So she called down. Sure enough, they had a Madison at the barbershop. And my daughter took me down because obviously I couldn't drive. So she took me down, and we're sitting there waiting. They allowed me to come inside. Everybody else had to wait outside, but they allowed me to come inside because I was on a walker at that time. So I asked my daughter, I said, "Which one do you think is Madison?" And she goes, "Do you recognize any of them?" I said, "Well, I kind of recognize most of them. I've been here before." So it wasn't a few minutes where this young, very beautiful, very sweet young girl walks up, dark hair, and she goes, "Hi, I'm Madison." She goes, "Are you Randy?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Okay, I think you're my next appointment." So she takes me back, and she starts to cut my hair. And Lisa's telling her about my experience, what I had gone through, not my NDEs, but just how sick I was, and I almost died. And So I said, Madison, I said, can I ask you some personal questions? And she said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I said, well, are both of your grandfathers still alive? And she goes, no. She says, my one grandfather who I was closest with passed away less than a year ago. Remember, this is when I talked to her in May of 2020, because he died less than a year ago. And I said, oh, I said, was he local? Did he live in our local area? And she goes, no. She goes, he lived up in Iowa. She goes, his whole life he lived in Iowa. And I said, well, have you ever visited this area? Nope, he's never visited this area either. And I said, was he a veteran? And she says, yes, he was a veteran. And that she says he talked about the Army and talked about Vietnam. And she says, so yeah, he was a veteran. And I said, Madison, I said, I think your grandfather came to me. So I told her what he said. I said, he came to me and he told Madison at the salon, her grandfather's okay. And he wants to know, Madison, that he's safe and he's okay. And so she starts crying. I'm crying. Lisa's crying. People in the barbershop are looking over saying, don't go to that hairstylist because she's going to make you cry. So I said, Madison, I said, now you remember, Lee, I was an investigator. So I put my very best investigator hat on and designed these questions specifically to lead me to verifying this. So I said, Madison, I said, he moved on to a white porch. Is that significant to you somehow? And that would have been his house in Iowa. It had a white porch, and he loved sitting on the white porch. She said, especially after he retired, he'd sit out there and work on the computer and talk to the people they passed by and everything. And I said, Madison, I said, he started to make red, white, and blue ribbons and American flags. I said, is that something that you know about? Lee, she looked at me like I had a third eye. And she said that he belonged to the American Legion in town. And every Veterans Day, the whole family would go down to support him and the veterans. And they made red, white, and blue ribbons and American flags to the veterans' graves.
Wow. There was your evidence, Detective.
Yeah. That was my physical evidence for sure, you know. Yeah. Because God knew that I needed that. He knew that I needed proof. He was showing it to me. I just didn't recognize it. Mm-hmm. But he said, okay, we got to get this guy what he wants. He's got to have something tangible, you know, that he knows that there is a heaven, that there is an afterlife, and I do have a plan for him. And he gave me that. Yeah. And by my physical evidence. So I have tangible proof that there is life after death. Totally changed my attitude about dying. I'm no longer afraid to die. It's very peaceful. And I don't fear it at all anymore.
There was one other thing I wanted to ask you about, the white-haired lady that you remembered coming in without a mask on while you were in the hospital to comfort you?
Yeah, the nurse that I talked to while I was intubated. Yeah, that was, when I came out of the hospital and started to get around a little bit, I had an appointment. I asked my wife if I could come along, and I wanted to go over to the hospital where I was and try to get up on the floor and thank some of the nurses that worked so diligently so I would survive. And there was one in particular that I just loved. Her name was Mallory. She had a very big black gas mask type thing on. And when I described it to her, she seemed somewhat surprised. She says, Mr. Schiefer, you were in a coma. She says, how did you know what type of mask that I was wearing? Or how did you know that, you know, I wore this, or I had my hair up in the bun? And I said, Mallory, I I saw you. I clearly saw you. And I said, I said, I had an older nurse, and I said, white hair, glasses, and I said, kind of short, not real tall. I said, she came in and talked to me every day. And she kind of looked at me, and I said, and she didn't have any protective equipment on. I said, because she would sit and rub my hand and hold my hand, and I could feel the skin to skin contact. And she kind of looked at me. She says, Mr. Schiefer, everybody that came in, you were in isolation. She goes, everybody that came in had to wear protective equipment, the mask, the gown, the gloves, the whole 9 yards. And I said, no, this lady didn't have that on at all. And she goes, besides, you had a tube down your throat. She says, how could you talk to anybody with a tube down your throat? And I said, well, I talked to somebody, and she came to visit me every day. And I just had it explained to me that, well, that was good. That was probably an angel, or one of my spirit guides that came and sat with me and talked with me. It let me know that it was going to be, okay. My guardian angel, maybe, that came and sat and talked to me. But I was told by the nurses that there was nobody that matched that description, and certainly nobody in my room without the proper, gear on. Right. So I had some beautiful conversations with her, whoever she is. I hope to see her again. So one of the important things that I wanted to stress, whoever may be listening to this, that may have a family member in a coma, is to talk to them, talk to them like we're talking right now. Have conversations with them, because they can hear, and a lot of times they can see, and it's so important. Hold their hand and comfort them, because they're present. They know that you're there, and they know, I couldn't have my family in to do that. And this nurse, whoever she was, certainly came in and took that place and comforted me during that time. And I heard my nurses talking. I heard my doctors talking, even though I was in the coma. So, it certainly enlightened me that now that I've kind of learned more about, the whole process, because I had to get educated on all of this. I didn't know what near-death experiences were, and or what I experienced, but I had such a passion to know. When I finished my master's degree, I told my wife, I said, I'm never reading another book again. And I held her to it. I didn't read a book. I said, but after this NDE, I have such a passion that I just want to learn more. And I started to investigate what had happened to me. And slowly I'm starting to come around and dealing with a lot of what I experienced, my journey.
Now, I think you said that you came back with a conviction that God wanted you to come back and tell people what you'd seen. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little about the reaction you got from medical staff and maybe clergy members, people that you did try to tell about your experience.
Lee, you should say lack of reaction that I got. I did. I tried to tell some of the nurses that did come in. I tried to tell them what had happened. And, they were very polite, and they would smile and shake their head and pat me on the hand, and said, oh, it was probably the drugs. I had doctors that came in, and I tried to explain it to them of what had happened and what I experienced. And I told them too, just as I had told you earlier, I had dreams and I had hallucinations, and I told them about that. And the response basically was, well, drugs will do funny things, and they didn't take me seriously. And it was frustrating to me that they wouldn't take me seriously or listen to what I had to say. I was being a veteran. I was in the Air Force, for 20 years. And I had to go to the VA for some medical tests. And I remember a couple of doctors, two doctors came into the room. One, I think he said was on training. I'm not sure. But I started to tell him about having COVID so bad and that I was on intubated and I was on ECMO and I was in a coma. And I was telling him about my experience. And I started to tell him, I said, I traveled somewhere. I had these experiences that were so real that I told him that I was in that city. And I told him about the little boy that told me to follow him and later told me my room wasn't ready. And that's about the only two stories I got out before one of the VA doctors just turned around and walked out of the room.
Wow.
The other VA doctor, you tell your story and you certainly quickly realize if they believe you or not, and I could tell he didn't believe a word I was saying. And that was frustrating. That hurt. And I wanted answers. I wanted answers of what happened to me, where I went, what I experienced. And I really thought the medical community would provide me some of those answers. And they didn't. They just blew it off to drugs, or they blew it off to, imagination, or I had lucid dreams, things of that nature. And I knew the difference. I knew it wasn't that. It was almost like when I went to my doctor and said, "Doc, I am sick." And they said, "Oh, you got the flu." And I said, "No, I don't have the flu." Same scenario, Doc. I've had this real experience. I went somewhere. I visited these areas. I experienced this. And they were just, "Oh, yeah, it's a drug, Matter of fact, I think one of the doctors told me one time, "Well, they have drugs that can help you on that, So I had to go to therapy. Yeah. So I came out with ICU delirium. Now, I had PTS for my dad's scenario, and then my sister, when she died, that compounded it. So I was undiagnosed. I dealt with that PTS throughout my life. And I came out of ICU with ICU delirium, and they told me that therapy would help. So I found a therapist that I thought that would be helpful, and he was highly recommended, that he knew how to treat PTS. And I went to see him, and I didn't tell him. I don't think I told him the first session. I went to see him a few times before I told him exactly what had happened to me. And he didn't have much to say about it. He just kind of looked and, the mind can do that now. And you can put yourself in meditation and experience the same thing. And, you just felt that he didn't put a whole lot of trust, I guess is the right word, into what I experienced. But I knew differently. So even the therapists weren't much help, and I wanted answers. So I went to the religious side. I said, okay, if I went to see God, if I experienced angels, surely if I talk to my local priest, he can help me deal with this. So I did. I went down and I saw the local priest, and I didn't have a dozen words out of my mouth until I realized he didn't believe a word that I was saying. And I really thought that he would accept what I was saying, that I went to heaven and I experienced spirits and I experienced God's love, and God made me scared in that big city because he knew I was lost, just like the lamb that was lost. So he had to make me feel scared, alone, and then I was found, and he found me. And they didn't want to hear it. I had local priests that, "Oh, wow, you really went on a interesting journey, didn't you?" And then that's all he said about it. So that became frustrating because I've been to doctors, I've been to therapists. Now I've been at the local churches, and to the therapist. And I was asked to speak at a Catholic women's breakfast. And when somebody had heard my story, and they asked me to come speak to these ladies, and I said, "Oh, I'd love to." I said, "But before I do, you better check with your priest." And they kind of looked at me funny, and I said, "If he doesn't believe in near-death experiences, he's not going to want me to talk." So they came back to me about a week and a half later and said, "We found another speaker. He doesn't want you to speak."
Wow.
So again, religious leaders weren't much help with me. I did find one religious leader who welcomed me, and he was excited for me, and he wanted to hear my stories, and he wanted to hear what I experienced and what I had seen and what I experienced, and he even invited me to come talk to their senior ministry, so they could hear that there is life after death, and you don't have to fear death. There's no reason to fear it because your spirit lives on. I heard a good term the other day. It's not really a death. He is in spirit. I like that. He is in spirit because your body, is our vessel. And once that wears out and dies, your spirit moves on. And that's what mine was. Mine moved on, and they just couldn't, they just kept kicking my spirit out of heaven. But it's important to find that one person that will listen to you. And the pastor that did listen, and we had our 1 hour meeting turned into a 2-hour session. And he has been very, very helpful with what I have saw and what I've experienced. He can relate it right back to the Bible, to where I was and who was maybe talking with me or what I experienced. And that became very helpful. So you've got to find that person. Lily is that person. I spoke with her. She called me and we spent a lot of time on the phone, and she was just absolutely wonderful.
Lily Moilo, our associate producer.
Yes. She was absolutely wonderful because she understands NDEs, and she understands what, I was in the military. 20 years I was in the military. I know guys from the military that have PTSD and who struggle. And I'm sure they can't find anybody. They don't even know what happened to them probably, or where they went or what they visited to. So it's important for us, it's important for me. I think part of my mission is to help people and help people understand, because I certainly didn't before my near-death experience. And it took me by myself, my diligence, to research and find out what happened to me. And fortunately, I was able to find some people that understood near-death experiences and wanted to listen to my story and helped me in understanding what exactly happened to me and continue to help me in understanding what I experienced. And that's helped like no wonder. I'm blessed by all the people that have come into my life.
Well, Randy, we've been blessed with your story, so thank you so much. We are about out of time, but I'd like you to. You're working on a book about your story, and it's not published yet. But tell us what the title's going to be, in case folks would like to be looking for it when it comes out.
Yeah, it's Surviving COVID-19 to the Veil and Back, and it's a family odyssey. Because I've asked my wife and my 3 girls to take and write one chapter out of the book of what they experienced and what they were feeling, and a little bit about each one of what they did. The prayers, certainly the prayer chain totally saved me.
Yes.
The internet, going out to 75,000 people, my daughter advocating for me, and my beautiful, lovely wife here at home. We've been married 49 years, just keeping the family unit together, and be ensuring everybody was getting along and working and helping me to survive.
Yeah.
So I'm only here by the grace of God and the goodwill of my family. So.
Well, thank you, Randy.
Thank you, sir,
for sharing your amazing story of your obsession with death and how 4 COVID NDEs saved your life. If folks would like to hear this show again, or any of our more than 400 archived ad-free NDE interviews, go to TalkZone's NDE Radio site and hit the Past Shows button, or go to our YouTube channel, NDE Radio with Lee Witting, where you can subscribe to and comment on the complete NDE Radio library. And be sure to like, follow, and share our NDE Radio Facebook page. Search NDE Radio with Lee Witting on your Facebook app. And listen again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern at TalkZone for more NDE Radio. I'm your host, Lee Witting, saying thanks for listening.